serial killer case file number 1. The Grim Sleeper, Lonnie David Franklin Jr. Born August 30th, 1952, died March 28, 2020. Better known by the nickname The Grim Sleeper. He was an American serial killer who was responsible for at least 10 murders and 1 attempted murder in Los Angeles, California from 1984 to 2007. He was also convicted for rape and sexual violence. Franklin earned his nickname when he appeared to have taken a 14-year break from his crimes from 1988 to 2002. In July 2010, Franklin was arrested as a suspect, and after many delays, his trial began in February 2016. On May 5, 2016, the jury convicted him of killing 9 women and 1 teenage girl. On June 6, 2016, the jury recommended a death penalty, and on August 10, 2016, the Los Angeles Superior Court sentenced him to death for each of the 10 victims named in the verdict. On March 28, 2020, Franklin was found dead in his cell at San Quentin State Prison. His early life. Lonnie David Franklin Jr. was born on August 30, 1952 and grew up in South Central Los Angeles. He married and had 2 children. He was given a dishonorable discharge from the United States Army in July 1975 after being released from prison for his conviction of gang raping a 17-year-old girl in Stuttgart, West Germany in April of 1974. Franklin and 2 other servicemen stationed in Stuttgart stopped to ask directions from the teen and offered her a ride home. When she accepted, they put a knife to her throat, drove her to a field and repeatedly raped her. She was able to feign interest in Franklin and asked for his phone number, by which police identified him. During the gang rape, photographs were taken by the rapist, as Franklin would also later do with the women he raped and murdered. In 1989, Franklin was convicted of 2 charges of theft, 1 charge of a misdemeanor assault, and 1 charge of battery. He only served time for 1 of the theft charges. Original 1980s investigation. In the mid-1980s, the Los Angeles Police Department became aware of an apparent serial killer targeting black women who were chronic drug users and street sex workers. The killer, dubbed the Southside Slayer, was believed to be responsible for stabbing and strangling at least 13 sex workers between 1983 and late 1985. At one point, the murders were colloquially known as the Strawberry Murders, strawberry being slang for the women who exchanged sex for drugs. In September 1985, the LAPD described the case at a press conference and asked for tips from the public. Following the press conference, the LAPD was heavily criticized for their failure to alert the South Central community of the possibility of a serial killer earlier. Activist Margaret Prescott and other community activists held weekly protests outside the LAPD headquarters in an effort to pressure the department into forming a task force to investigate the murders. Prescott contrasted the apparent lack of police interest in the South Central murders with the significant attention given to the investigation of Richard Ramirez, the serial killer dubbed the Night Stalker, who targeted women in upscale areas of Los Angeles and San Francisco between June 1984 and August 1985. Prescott accused the LAPD of indifference to the death of the women who were poor black drug users and sex workers, which the LAPD denied. By January 1986, 15 murders had been linked to the case. More detectives were added to the joint LAPD-LASD investigation, which had become known as the Southside Slayer Task Force. But by 1986, the case was still under investigation. Prescott formalized her group of activists as a community group called the Black Coalition Fighting Black Serial Murders, and in March 1986 pressured the Los Angeles City Council to increase the reward money they were offering for information on the killer from $10,000 to $25,000. By late 1986, conflicting modus operandi and suspect descriptions caused the investigators to doubt their original theory of a single killer being responsible for all the murders. Evidence suggested that several serial killers, possibly 4 or more, were murdering women in South Los Angeles. The Southside Slayer Task Force began downsizing in 1987 due to the lack of results relative to the expense and manpower being used. Task Force Commander Lieutenant John Zorn told the Los Angeles Times in December 1987 the flow of clues is almost non-existent at this point. Over the following years, it was found that serial killer Louis Crane committed at least 2 of the so-called Southside Slayer murders, and serial killers Michael Hughes, Daniel Lee Shibert, Chester Turner, and Ivan Hill committed at least 1 each. In addition, some of the murders may have been committed individually by the women's pimps or clients unrelated to any serial killer. The murders of Judith Simpson, Cynthia Walker, and Latanya Johnson, all committed with a 9mm pistol in late 1988, were also investigated by the Southside Slayer Task Force. Sheriff's Detective Ricky Ross was arrested for the murders after being found with drugs and a sex worker in a vehicle that had a rusted 9mm Beretta semi-automatic pistol in the trunk. Ross was charged with the murders after his gun was forensically linked by the LAPD to the bullets from the murders. He was released after independent forensic analysis found it unlikely that Ross's gun was the murder weapon. All 3 of these murders remained unsolved. One particular group of killings, which were linked by common elements, including the use of a .25 caliber firearm, remained unsolved and unaccounted for by any of the other known serial killers. The first known murder in the series was the murder of Deborah Jackson in August 1985, which was linked to the August 1986 murder of Henrietta Wright by forensic firearm examination. By 1987, there were 7 victims linked to the same gun, all of whom had been shot in the chest at close range. 2 decades later, the perpetrator of those crimes was dubbed the Grim Sleeper, due to the long period of apparent inactivity between murders. In May 2007, the slaying of Janika Peters, 25, was linked through DNA analysis to at least 11 unsolved murders in Los Angeles, the first of which occurred in 1985. In early September 2008, Los Angeles officials announced that they were offering a $500,000 reward to help catch the killer. On November 1st, the case was featured on the Fox program America's Most Wanted. On February 25th, 2009, Bratton addressed the press for the first time regarding the case, at which time the police formally gave the killer the name the Grim Sleeper, the nickname chosen by LA Weekly. Bratton also released a 911 call from the 1980s in which a man reported seeing a body being dumped by Franklin, giving a detailed description and license plate number of a van connected to the now closed Cosmopolitan Church. In May 2009, Pelesk conducted an extensive interview with Anitra Washington, the sole survivor of Franklin's attacks. Washington described him as a black man in his early 30s. He looked neat, tidy, kind of geeky. He wore a black polo shirt tucked into khaki trousers. She also described the interior and exterior of his vehicle. Law enforcement missed an opportunity to catch Franklin because his DNA was not previously collected. In 2003, Franklin was convicted of a felony and was serving 3 years of supervised probation. In 2004, voters passed Proposition 69, which requires that DNA 69 DNA must be collected from all felons and everyone arrested on certain specified charges. It also required the expansion of a DNA database. Authorities collected and sorted through thousands of DNA samples while he was on probation. Franklin's DNA was supposed to have been entered into the database. It wasn't entered because between November 2004 and August 2005, probation officers did not collect samples from people who were on unsupervised probation. The probation department did not have the resources to collect samples until August 2005. Franklin was identified at least in part on familiar DNA analysis. The police had found no exact match between DNA found at the crime scene and any of the profiles in California's DNA profile database, so they searched the database for stored profiles that demonstrated sufficient similarity to allow police to infer a familial relationship. They found similar DNA belonging to Franklin's son Christopher, who had been convicted of a felony weapons charge in 2008. Christopher was too young to have committed the murders, but the familial DNA match led investigators to look at his father, Lonnie, as the likely perpetrator. One undercover police officer pretended to be a waiter at a restaurant where Franklin ate, collecting dishes, silverware, glasses, and pizza crust to obtain DNA. According to Cooley, detectives then used the pieces of discarded pizza along with saliva found on the victims to establish a DNA match. And on July 7, 2010, Franklin was arrested. The Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office charged him with 10 counts of murder, 1 count of attempted murder, and special circumstance allegation of multiple murders. On December 16, 2010, the LAPD released 180 photos of women found in Franklin's home after unsuccessful attempts to identify the individuals who were possible additional victims. These people are not suspects. We don't even know if they are victims, but we do know this. Lonnie Franklin's reign of terror in the city of Los Angeles, which spanned well over 2 decades, culminated with over a dozen murder victims, certainly needs to be investigated further, says the police chief Charlie Beck. In all, investigators found over 1,000 photos and several hundred hours of video in his home. The images show mainly black women of a wide age range from teenagers to middle-aged to older, often nude. Police believe Franklin took many of the pictures, which show both conscious and unconscious individuals dating back 30 years. The photos were released to the public in an effort to identify the women. On November 3, 2011, Reuters reported that the police were considering Franklin as a suspect in 6 more slayings. The police were investigating 2 of the 6 as potential victims killed during a 14-year lapse between an initial spat of grim sleeper murders that ended in 1988 and several more that began in 2002. Of the remaining 4 victims, 2 bodies were discovered in the 1980s and 2 were reported missing in 2005, but the remains of the other 2 were never found, the police said. Detectives said they linked Franklin to the 6 additional killings after reviewing hundreds of old case files and seeking the public's help in identifying a collection of 180 photographs of women and girls that were found in his possession. Franklin was charged with 10 murders and 1 attempted murder and held without bail. He was never charged in the death of a suspected 11th victim, a black man, a crime of which DNA evidence was not found. After a lengthy pre-trial discovery and several delays, the trial opened on February 16, 2016. Closing arguments began May 2, 2016, and the jury began deliberating May 4, 2016. On May 5th, 2016, after nearly 3 months of trial and a day and a half of jury deliberation, Franklin was convicted on all counts. His sentencing hearing began a week later on May 12, 2016. At the hearing, prosecutors presented evidence relating to 4 other victims they believed to have been killed by Franklin. The 4 victims were not among the original set identified by DNA and ballistic evidence as Grim Sleeper victims, and had only been identified as such after his arrest. 3 victims, Sharon Alicia Dismuke, Inez Warren and Georgia May Thompson, were identified as likely Grim Sleeper victims by task force officers investigating unsolved missing persons and homicide reports dating back to 1976. The 4th, Rolenia Morris, was identified from evidence found at Franklin's garage after his arrest. Her body was never found. Prosecutors did not charge Franklin with these murders for fear of delaying the trial even further. On June 6, 2016, a Los Angeles County jury sentenced Franklin to death. On August 10th, the Superior Court sentenced Franklin on each count naming the individual victims. On March 28, 2020, Franklin was found dead in his cell. There was no signs of trauma to his body. His cause of death and results of the autopsy have not been publicly released. Victims. Prosecutors suspect that Lonnie Franklin's first victim was Sharon Alicia Dismuke, who was killed on January 15, 1984. His first confirmed victim, though, was Deborah Jackson, whose murder occurred in August 1985. Franklin apparently took a 14-year hiatus after his last known crime in 1988, and his next confirmed murder occurred in 2002. As a result of his apparent dormancy, he was nicknamed the Grim Sleeper. Investigators have stated they believe it is likely that there were other as yet unidentified victims during that time frame. The last confirmed murder was in January 2007. All but one of his victims were black women. One of his suspected victims was a black man. Many of his victims were sex workers, and Franklin was known to have frequent contact with sex workers. All of his victims were found outdoors, often in alleys in a short distance from downtown Los Angeles. He shot all of his victims with a .25 caliber gun. Franklin took many photographs of nude women and kept his records in his garage. If you like that, then check out our Patreon, where for just $5 a month you get access to exclusive shows like Real Monsters and Playing with Bones with Amy Rose, along with early access to all our minisodes and ad-free access to the Weekend Update and It's Alive Alive! Not convinced yet? Well, head on over now and have 7 days on us. That's a 7-day free trial for all new members. That's It's Alive Alive Pod on Patreon. It's Alive Alive! All the guts and go with none of the guilt. See you on Wednesdays, unless you're on Patreon when you get us all week long.